A young woman fights to survive after being captured by a fanatical cult, convinced that her sacrifice will save them. But they have no idea they're about to unleash a nightmare far worse than anything they fear. The story takes place many years after the rapture. The remaining survivors have taken refuge in the forest, where a religious cult believes that speaking is sinful and has had their members' vocal cords completely removed. Deep in the wilderness, Azrael and her boyfriend Keenan manage to escape the cult and hide deep in the forest. Moments later, while searching for berries to make a handmade bracelet for Keenan, Azrael hears a suspicious noise. Paranoid, she checks her surroundings but sees nothing. She rushes back to Keenan only to panic when she realizes he just lit a campfire, so she quickly puts it out, knowing the smoke will lead the cult straight to them. Upset and anxious, she walks away, but Keenan follows and holds her tight as a sign of apology. She forgives him, they share a tender kiss, and she places the bracelet on his arm. Right then, a piercing whistle cuts through the silence. The cult members are closing in. They sprint through the trees, desperate for a hiding spot. Sensing they are trapped, Keenan suggests they split up to confuse their pursuers and takes off. Azrael flees in the opposite direction, but she's spotted. She tries to outrun her chaser, but a second cultist cuts her off, kicking her squarely in the stomach. Weak and defeated, she is dragged toward the cars, only to watch in horror as Keenan is captured too. He tries to fight, but a knife to his throat forces him into submission as they are loaded into separate car trunks. As the cars are driving away, Azrael notices that the vehicle carrying Keenan heads in a completely different direction. She desperately kicks the trunk door, but to no avail. Shortly after, the car stops and the two cult members drag her out to a specific location in the forest where the rest of the cult is waiting. Azrael is forcefully forced into a wooden chair and tied down. As one of the cult leaders, Josephine, approaches, Azrael begs her using gestures, but Josephine dismisses it. She grabs a knife and cuts Azrael's leg, causing blood to flow and preparing her for the sacrifice. Suddenly, a strong wind blows, causing the trees, along with hanging bottles and cans, to shake violently, a sign that something dark is coming. After the wind subsides, the cult members standing nearby face outward, beginning to chant using only their breath. As the chanting continues, Azrael begins to panic. One of the creatures emerges, slowly making its way toward her, drawn by the fresh scent of her blood. Desperate to escape, she struggles against her restraints until the wooden armrest finally snaps. A cult member notices her and rushes over to pin her down, but Azrael fights back, plunging the sharp piece of wood into his throat. As blood pours from the wound, the creature catches him, drags him into the branches of a tree, and devours him alive. Seizing the opportunity, a terrified Azrael sprints into the woods. Meanwhile, the rest of the cult continues chanting, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding behind them. Moments later, one member realizes someone is missing. Turning around, they discover that Azrael has escaped, and the creature is dragging their companion away. Meanwhile, Azrael stops by a river to clean her wound before continuing through the forest in search of medicinal leaves. She sits down for a moment and covers her injury, unaware that one of the creatures is slowly approaching behind her. Just in time, Azrael notices the creature and quickly hides inside a nearby cave, pressing herself into a dark corner while tightly covering her wound. Unable to detect the scent of blood, the burned one eventually leaves, allowing Azrael to breathe a sigh of relief. Soon after, she continues walking until she reaches a road and notices a tire track. Realizing it belongs to the cult, she follows it until she reaches their camp. With a guard stationed at the entrance, Azrael sneaks around to the back and discovers a weak section of the fence. She quietly slips through and moves between the vehicles, trying not to be seen. While hiding, she notices the bracelet she made for Canaan and picks it up, fearing that something terrible may have happened to him. Moments later, Josephine appears with another cult member, discussing something that forces Azrael to quickly hide. When they separate, Azrael hides behind a tent as Josephine enters the same tent. Inside, Josephine is taking care of her mother, who is lying weakly on a bed. Azrael remains hidden outside, quietly watching from behind the tent. Soon after, Josephine enters the church, where Miriam, the pregnant leader of the cult, performs a ritual with the other members. Standing before a hole in the wall, Miriam listens to the wind, convinced it carries the will of God, and that she alone can receive its message. As the ritual ends, Miriam blows out the altar candle and dismisses the gathering. As the cult members leave the church, Josephine stays behind and approaches Miriam. Suddenly, Miriam slaps her across the face, blaming her for failing the ritual. Moments later, they hear a noise outside. Miriam looks through the window, but no one is there. Unbeknownst to them, Azrael is hiding beneath the church, narrowly avoiding discovery. Miriam sends Josephine outside to search the area. Azrael quietly moves, trying to stay hidden, but just as she thinks the coast is clear, Josephine suddenly grabs her by the leg. Josephine attempts to choke her, but Azrael fights back and kicks her in the face, knocking her unconscious. Azrael quickly escapes outside, keeping low and moving silently to avoid detection before hiding behind a tent, as many cultists are now outside. Shortly after, Josephine regains consciousness and rings the bell, alerting the entire camp. The cult members immediately begin striking bottles and pans to spread the warning. Panicked, Azrael rushes toward the fence, tearing her hands on the barbed wire as a few cultists spot her and run toward her. She manages to squeeze through the barbed wire, but one cultist grabs her feet. Azrael kicks them and manages to break free. The others fire at her as she runs, but she narrowly avoids the shots and flees into the forest. Azrael runs as far as she can, but as dusk sets in, exhaustion finally takes over. The deep cuts on her hands leave a trail of blood on the trees and rocks, attracting a creature that emerges to lick the blood. Terrified, Azrael sprints away as a second burned creature joins the chase. Fortunately, one creature trips and falls, and as Azrael continues to run, the second burned one also trips and falls, allowing Azrael to break free and reach the road. Suddenly, a car screeches to a halt, nearly hitting her. A man steps out, startling Azrael, who fears he is a cultist. However, the stranger speaks and asks if she is a survivor and helps her up. Too panicked, Azrael scrambles into the car and frantically pounds on the dashboard, urging him to drive. The man gets behind the wheel and speeds off into the night. While driving, the man notices her injuries and hands her a cloth for her wounds, explaining that his home at the end of the road is safe and stocked with food. Azrael tries to signal that she cannot speak by pointing to a cross-shaped scar on her neck, but the man doesn't understand. After a failed attempt at conversation, he turns on the radio, and Azrael listens to the music, but their relief is short-lived. Out of nowhere, a bullet strikes the driver in the head. A cultist stands in the middle of the road, firing at the vehicle. The out-of-control truck plows directly over the shooter before crashing into a wall. Minutes later, a bleeding and dazed Azrael stumbles out of the wreckage. She collapses to her knees, only to see that the cultist is still alive. Azrael leaps on him, and they brutally wrestle for the gun, accidentally firing a shot as they roll into the forest. They split up, and the cultist tries to shoot her again, but his weapon is out of ammo. Instead, he uses the heavy gun to smash Azrael's legs. Spotting the fallen magazine on the ground, Azrael grabs it, bashes the cultist in the head, and crawls toward the gun. She manages to reload, but the cultist tackles her from behind in a chokehold. In a final struggle, Azrael maneuvers the barrel against him and pulls the trigger, killing him instantly. As Azrael continues pushing through the woods, she spots a man slumped on a tree branch. Fearing it's another cultist, she approaches with her gun raised, only to realize in shock that it's actually Kenan. But just as she reaches out for him, she steps directly into a hidden snare. A rope snaps tightly around her ankle, instantly flipping her upside down. Suddenly, a cult member emerges from the brush, snatches her fallen gun, and brutally strikes Kenan with it. Just then, the wind howls through the trees, forcing the cultist to scan his surroundings. Desperate to escape, Azrael tries to climb her own rope, but the friction violently reopens the cuts on her hands. When she looks back down, one of the creatures emerges, slams the cultist against a tree, and begins devouring him alive. Panicking, Azrael channels every ounce of strength she has left, ignoring the agonizing pain in her hands, and manages to scramble up to the safety of a high branch. From her perch, she watches in horror as two more burned creatures arrive to join the gruesome feast. Once they are finished, the other burned ones drag the cultist's severed head away into the darkness. Then, the remaining creatures turn their attention to Kenan. Azrael can only watch helplessly as they begin biting him until one of them drags Kenan's body away. The other burned one remains behind, drawn to Azrael by the scent of blood. It begins climbing the tree toward her. Terrified, Azrael desperately unties the rope around her ankle. Just as the creature reaches her and lunges to attack, she manages to wrap the rope around its neck and pushes it away, causing both of them to fall toward the ground. Azrael survives the impact, while the creature is left hanging from the branches above. She grabs the gun and moves deeper into the forest. Soon after, she returns to the camp and hides behind a tree, where she whistles to mimic the cult's signal. Hearing the signal, Josephine leads a small group of followers into the forest to investigate, leaving the camp unguarded. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Azrael sneaks back inside through the same hole in the fence as before. She carefully makes her way into the chapel and finds Miriam. Raising the gun, Azrael slowly approaches her, but Miriam reveals her pregnant belly and pretends to be helpless. Distracted by the sight, Azrael hesitates, giving Miriam the chance to lunge forward, disarm her, and strike her in the head with a pan. As Azrael falls, she manages to scratch Miriam's belly before losing consciousness. Afterward, Josephine and the other cult members drag Azrael into the woods. They smear her blood across her face and listen to the wind before throwing her into a coffin. They quickly seal it shut and bury her beneath the sand. Trapped and terrified, Azrael struggles inside the coffin with no one coming to help her. Suddenly, a lantern lights up near her feet, revealing a hidden tunnel connected to the coffin. She grabs the lantern and crawls through the passage, only to be shocked by a burned one waiting at the end. Azrael immediately retreats back into the coffin, but the creature follows and climbs on top of her. Instead of attacking, the burned one sniffs her hands and detects Miriam's blood from when Azrael scratched her earlier. Because of the scent, the creature backs away. Relieved, Azrael crawls through the tunnel once again and manages to escape. Back at the camp, the cult members return to their tents to rest. Josephine stays behind to care for her mother before joining Miriam in the chapel, where they treat Miriam's injury. Suddenly, they hear a noise outside. Josephine rushes out to investigate and discovers her mother's tent engulfed in flames. She desperately tries to put out the fire, and the other cult members rush to help, but it is already too late. Moments later, the flames spread rapidly throughout the camp. Amid the chaos, Azrael takes the opportunity to strike, shooting the cult members one by one while remaining hidden. Josephine watches in horror and tries to escape, but Azrael catches up to her and shoots her in the stomach. Suddenly, a gas canister ignites and explodes, sending shockwaves throughout the camp. Another cult member discovers his girlfriend's lifeless body and grabs a gun, determined to kill Azrael. Gunshots are exchanged between them as the fire spreads rapidly across the camp. Confused by the whistling coming from every direction, the man fires at a shadow, only to realize he has accidentally shot one of his own people. Frozen in shock, he fails to notice Azrael approaching from behind. She quickly strikes him down with a machete. Azrael then returns to the chapel, but as she enters, Miriam attacks her from behind, disarms her, and begins chasing her through the room. Miriam pushes the benches aside as she tries to catch Azrael, eventually slamming her against a table and attempting to kill her. However, Azrael fights back and kicks her away. When Miriam attacks again, Azrael dodges, causing Miriam to crash into the wall. Azrael then bites her neck as Miriam struggles in pain. Suddenly, Miriam's water breaks. Before Azrael can react, a gunshot is fired and narrowly misses her. Josephine continues shooting while slowly approaching, weakened by her injuries. But she stops when she realizes Miriam is about to give birth. Taking the opportunity, Azrael attacks Josephine and tackles her to the ground, smashing a bench in the process. Josephine grabs a piece of wood and strikes Azrael, but Azrael retaliates by smashing her head against the bench. Josephine pulls out a small blade, but Azrael blocks her attack and uses Miriam's knife to stab her in the neck. A baby's cry suddenly echoes through the chapel. Josephine pulls the knife from her neck, collapses, and finally dies. Miriam looks at the newborn in shock and terror. Realizing the truth, she grabs Azrael's machete and takes her own life. Moments later, a powerful wind sweeps through the chapel, extinguishing every candle. A horde of burned ones emerges from the forest and storms inside. Azrael, holding the baby in her arms, stares at it in disbelief. The child has the form of a goat-like creature, the Antichrist. The truth is finally revealed. The voice Miriam heard through the hole in the wall was never the voice of God, but a deception from the devil that led her to believe she was carrying a savior. The burned ones roar in celebration, accepting the child as their new leader. As Azrael looks at the creatures surrounding her, she realizes she is no longer their prey. She now carries the one thing that makes them bow to her, becoming the protector of a new ruler. Hope you enjoy the recap. You can watch the next video for another great story. Thank you for watching.